Today we'll be talking about ethical and cultural considerations in evaluations. Our objectives are to understand ethical decisions at various steps in the evaluation process, identify the need for and the components of informed consent and child assent forms, describe the difference between anonymity and confidentiality, understand the impact of culture in regard to the evaluation process, identify cultural competency skills required of evaluators, and identify cultural frameworks influencing the evaluation. So first we'll be talking about ethical considerations. So within each step of the evaluation process, there are ethical issues to consider. So we talked about the steps before, but again, they're developing the questions, selecting a design, specifying how variables are measured, selecting your participants, selecting a data collection method, analyzing the data, and writing and disseminating the report. So the first major component that we'll talk about for ethical issues is in step 3, so when you're developing the questions. Your questions should be meaningful, concrete, useful, and as well as reliable and valid. They should directly or indirectly benefit the participants, contribute to professional social work knowledge base, and hold a minimal level of risk for your participants. Some other things you can do to help you develop questions that are meaningful is to evaluate the literature. Your textbook talks about the Campbell collaboration, which is a good resource. And we also at Westchester have access to the Cochrane collaboration, which has a number of topics of systematic reviews and meta-analyses that are very detailed and can be very helpful when you're asking questions. You can also look just in general for systematic reviews and meta-analyses, which cover assessment and treatment of health, mental health, and social work. Some ethical issues to consider when you're selecting a design for your evaluation, which we'll be talking about later, but these are just some ethical considerations. Do you want to randomize your sample into 2 groups or do you not? If you do randomize, are you going to have a control group that receives no intervention, or are they going to be on a wait list so they don't have the intervention right away, but they will receive it if it's shown to be effective? This image here shows a pre-test, post-test control group design, which is also known as a randomized controlled trial. So the red circle indicates your total population, so all of your participants, and then you take that group and you would randomly assign them to one of the program groups. So the blue box shows those people that were assigned to the intervention group, and the green box shows people that were assigned to the control group, which they would receive no program, or maybe they're receiving another program instead of your new program that you're developing. And you can have more than 2 programs in this randomization process, but the most common is 2, so that's what we're going to use. And then the pre-test, post-test is just maybe you're identifying their level of anxiety before your program, so at pre-test, and then again after your program has been completed, so at post-test. And you would do the same thing, evaluate the pre-test for the people that are not in your program or they're in a comparison program, and then again evaluate them after that comparison program or at the same time as your people that receive the program are evaluated. Some other issues in selecting a design are beneficence, which is how to maximize benefit and minimize harm to your participants when considering how to best test the effectiveness of an intervention. And equipoise, which is the uncertainty principle. This basically just means that you don't want to assign your participants to groups if you know that one intervention is for certain less successful than the other intervention. Moving on, the next section is ethical issues when specifying how your variables are measured. So these are some questions to ask yourself when you are deciding how to measure your variables. You want to base the selection of which variables you're measuring on literature instead of measuring everything and kind of just looking for any results. So you want to find things that you need to be measuring. You don't want to collect all of this information and then end up not using most of it. So focus groups and pilot testing are crucial to ethics when you don't know a lot of information or you have no information about the social problem you're addressing in a specific culture or the population of your interest. So, for example, if you are studying refugees from a country you know nothing about and you know nothing about your culture, you don't want to just go ahead and start your intervention or survey. You want to talk to some of those stakeholders or participants or potential participants to get an idea of what their cultural background is and what might be appropriate or inappropriate for them, as well as the literacy level. You may need to do more interview type questions as opposed to asking them to fill out a detailed, lengthy survey that's written in English. Or maybe you need to use a translator and have that survey translated into their native language so that they can fill it out more easily. Some other ideas: you don't want to have biased language that's related to gender, age, sexual orientation, and other cultural factors. Your variables or questions or scales have to be linked to a specific evaluation question. You don't want to be asking questions or using scales that you are then not going to use to help improve the program or to help determine if your program is actually effective. So everything you're asking these participants needs to be used and reported in your evaluation report. Many times you want to use both quantitative, so numbers, and qualitative, more stories, in your evaluation. That way you have a more full picture of what the story is behind whatever you're trying to measure. Some other things: if you have a very small group of participants, do you really need to collect super detailed demographics and location variables? Because if that is something you're doing, your participants may be able to be identified from that information. So say you only had one Hispanic participant among your 10 participants in this intervention. If you collect ethnicity and you specify that there's one person who's Hispanic and 9 who were not, that person is easily identifiable in those results then. So you want to be careful with that, especially with smaller groups. So now we'll talk about ethical issues when selecting your participants. So you want to make sure that your sampling method is driven by your evaluation's purpose. Sometimes the sampling method is influenced by your own values, and sometimes it's about just convenience. So try and make sure that you're really keeping the evaluation's purpose in mind. Are your potential participants representative of your target population? So the target population would be the group most affected by the question you're trying to answer. Your textbook talks more about this in Toolkit H, and we'll also get into more details about this later in the class, but just something to think about, because if your participants are not representative of your target population, you can't generalize the results you find back to that target population because it would be unethical. Many times you'll need to seek approval through your agency's IRB or institutional review board. So if you're going to generalize the knowledge in an external publication or presentation at a conference, if you're going to post this program online, you'll need to go through an IRB to get approval. So if your agency doesn't have an IRB, you may want to partner with a university or another organization that does have an IRB so that you can distribute your results at conferences or other things. And the one exception to that, if you're just doing an evaluation to improve the program in your own agency, you don't necessarily need to seek IRB approval unless your agency requires that. So if you aren't trying to generalize beyond your agency, you typically don't need to receive IRB approval. But if you want to take those results beyond your agency, you do need to get IRB approval. Another factor there is HIPAA, so the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. You want to make sure that any information you're collecting doesn't break HIPAA laws. Next is, are you going to have your participants remain anonymous or confidential? So anonymity means that no one knows which evaluation participant gave what response. So for example, you receive a mailed survey and it doesn't have any identifying marks or name associated with it, so you have no idea who it came from. Versus confidentiality is that you know how a particular participant responded, but you have agreed not to divulge that information, who that respondent is, to anyone else. Sometimes asking demographic questions, if you have that small population like we were talking about, it could turn your participants from anonymous to confidential, because if you only have, say, one African American participant and that's identified, it's no longer anonymous because you know who that participant is. But it would be confidential because you're not going to share that information with anyone else. And then the final thing when you're selecting participants is you want to make sure that your participants are mentally and legally competent to understand and sign an informed consent form. So this is really important, especially if you're dealing with people who are not considered mentally and legally competent, because then you need to be in touch with their legal guardian to get permission for them to be included in this study. So some basic provisions of informed consent are the voluntary choice of someone to participate based on an understanding of the purpose, procedure, risk, benefit, alternatives, and other relevant factors of your study. And unless you specifically waive, if your IRB specifically waives this, the informed consent must be documented with a written consent form approved by the IRB and signed by the participant or their legally authorized representative or guardian. Even if you aren't going through an IRB, you should probably still use an informed consent form for grant purposes or program improvement. So 3 main parts of the informed consent process are the information exchange. So it includes participant recruitment materials, oral instructions, written materials, question and answer sessions, and that they agree to this process with a documented signature. Next would be comprehension. So you need to be sure that the participant understands the informed consent before they participate in the study, as well as ongoing throughout the study. And finally, they must be voluntary. So their choice to participate or continue to participate in the study has to be voluntary. So you can't withhold services from them because they wouldn't participate in this study. Some appropriate consent forms, the language should be understandable to the participant, so you would want to try and use a 7th to 8th grade reading level. Some resources are listed on this page to help create a readable form. Some of these have options that are at that level that you could use. There's also some resources that you can calculate the grade level of reading comprehension on certain programs like Microsoft Word to see if it would be understandable to whomever you're giving this to. Other things that should be included would be a withdrawal notice so that they won't be penalized if they withdraw from the study. Specifically if you're at Westchester, you have to have the contact info of the Westchester Office of Sponsored Research, and then you have to have the 8 bolded headings, specifically at Westchester, that contain those components. So the 8 headings that you have to include and have explained on your informed consent forms, specifically for Westchester, but it's good to have overall wherever you are so that people understand everything that there may be occurring during their study, is the nature and purpose of the project, an explanation of what exactly they'll be going through, identifying any experimental treatments or procedures that haven't been proven necessarily, discomfort and risks to the participant, potential benefits to the participant, confidentiality versus anonymity. You want to identify that. If they receive any compensation, you'll want to talk about that. Maybe you're giving them a $5 gift card for attending all 5 sessions or something. That would need to be included there. And then you would want to have the name of the person to contact in case of a research-related injury. If one of the resources posted on D2L has a sample informed consent form so that you have something to go off of. So if you want to look at that, it's in the IRB faculty guidelines document, and it's on page B3. So that's something that you can always use in the future to base your informed consent form. So if you're dealing with children or minors under the age of 18, you'll want to have the parents or legal guardian sign the informed consent form for allowing them to participate. And then after the parent, the legal guardian signs that form, you'll want to have the child or minor assent or agree to be part of the study. So assent is different from informed consent because they're basically just agreeing that, yes, they know they'll be in the study and they will participate. So this should be simplified language, especially if you're if you're using children who are around age 5, you want to use simple language that they'll understand. So if they can't read or sign the written assent form, you should have a verbal script that you're going to use and have recorded submission of that. And again, in the IRB faculty guidelines, there's some sample of these assent and parental guardian informed consent forms as well. Some ethical issues when you're selecting a data collection method. So how are your data collected? Are you using phone interviews, an online survey, an in-person interview, focus group, or just a general survey in person? So choosing these different types of data can introduce bias unintendedly. You may coerce some people and potentially exclude other participants because, say you're using a phone interview and you're only calling home phones. Well, many people don't have a home phone number, so you're excluding all of those people because you would not be able to reach them on a home phone number. Next, you'll want to look at who is collecting the data. So a participant may respond differently than they would normally if they think that the people who have authority over them may see their responses. So if you are the person implementing the program, but you're also submitting or having them fill out this questionnaire, they may skew their results positively because they want you to think that you're doing a good job or you're really helping, or maybe they're scared that their treatment will be ended. So that's something to think about. You usually want to have an external person come in to administer the surveys. Another example of this, I don't know how many of you have experienced this, but at the end of the semester, there's usually a faculty person that comes in who's not your professor to implement this faculty survey of how they did in the class, what your experience was, and any feedback you may have. So we have someone that is not your professor administer that so that you are more honest and you know that that person who's your professor won't see that information until after the semester has ended and you have your grade. Next, you'll want to look at the frequency and timing of data collection. So informed consent should clearly describe the timeline and any follow-up data collection after participation in the program is finished. Some ethical issues when analyzing your data and disseminating the report. So did you answer your evaluation questions, or did you just ask random questions and see what you found? You want to always be answering your evaluation questions. You don't want to just go fishing for information. Did you create and disseminate an interim, so while your program or intervention was going on, as well as a final evaluation report to your stakeholders with suggested recommendations? And for the writing and disseminating the report, did you acknowledge any negative findings, lack of rigor in your evaluation design, and any attrition, so people leaving the program or not coming to all of the sessions? Cultural competence is basically not a state when you arrive in, but it's a process of learning, unlearning, relearning, and it's cultivated throughout your life. So some culturally significant factors can include race and ethnicity, religion, social class, language, disability, sexual orientation, age, and gender, among many others. Some other dimensions could include geographic region, socioeconomic circumstances, and anything else really that goes into shaping culture. The culturally competent evaluator or team of evaluators must have specific knowledge of the people and the place in which the evaluation is conducted. So this should include local history, culturally determined morals, values, and ways of knowing how the world is for these people that you're working with. So the impact of culture. It's a filter through which we perceive. It's a framework which within we process information, and it affects our communication processes. So ethnocentrism is defining the world in your own terms, and enculturation is how you as a child learn to behave in certain ways that are appropriate to your culture. So both of those things affect how your culture influences how you. So the rationale for targeted and culturally sensitive programs. There's a growing ethnic and racial diversity in the population. There are many differences in history and attitudes as well as behavior across those groups. Health and mental disparities are very different among different ethnic and racial groups. There are differences in prevalence of groups. And this just shows how we have a projection um, by the Census Bureau of how the white non-Hispanic population is projected to decrease by 2050, and the Hispanic population is expected to increase, as well as Black, Asian, and other races. So this is just showing the need for increased cultural competence based on projected population changes. So here are just some landmark reports on minority health disparity and inequity. These are great places to look if you are writing grants. You may want to cite some or all of these reports to show that you need to help reduce disparity, especially if you're working in a region that has many different racial backgrounds. So there's the Secretary's Task Force. This was the first documented health status disparities of minority groups. It also contributed to Healthy People 2000, which has been updated to Healthy People 2020. So that's also someplace you can look. The initiative to eliminate racial and ethnic disparities in health, as well as the U.S. Office of Management. So culture and social work. Cultural competence refers to practitioners and the capacity of individuals to practice cultural sensitivity. So these are the actual practice and of being culturally sensitive. And cultural sensitivity just refers to the extent to which ethnic or cultural norms of a target population and the relevant historical, environment, or social forces are incorporated into design, implementation, and evaluation of programs. Some ethical practices related to cultural competence involved using appropriate approaches that are appropriate to the context. So maybe you're going to use verbal consent in a community with large oral tradition, who have a high level of concern about privacy or very low levels of literacy. You may want to incorporate ways to make findings accessible to all stakeholders, including forms of communication beyond written text and languages other than English. You want to consider the unintended consequences when reporting findings. So, in some cultures, participants may be proud of their accomplishments and don't really care about anonymity because they want their name attached to their story. But in other cultures, this would be completely inappropriate. So, you want to make sure that you are very sensitive to which culture you're dealing with, someone who wants their name attached and is okay with this information, or someone who that is infringing on their rights. Um, if you receive federal funding at your agency, you're required to provide these different standards, but it is recommended for other agencies as well. So you want to have cultural and linguistic competence. So it's a set of behaviors, attitudes, and policies coming together in a system, agency, or among professionals, enabling effective work in cross-cultural situations. So the Office of Minority National Standards for Culturally and Linguistically Appropriate Services in Health and Healthcare are the national class standards, and you can view them at that website. So these are very important, but these four that are listed here are the most important in relation to program evaluation. So that's something to look into and kind of keep in the back of your mind while you're doing evaluations. And the blueprint for advancing and sustaining class standards in policy and practice is posted on D2L. This document provides practical strategies. So when you're doing an evaluation in your career, so in 3 years from now, you're assigned to do the evaluation, and you have a culturally diverse population you're serving. You can go to this document and it'll give you strategies for what you should actually do to help you in that situation. So these are the 4 class standards that are most related to evaluation. So conducting organizational assessments. So this is just seeing if what your assets are, weaknesses, and opportunities to improve your organization before doing an evaluation. The next one is to collect and maintain demographic data. So all of those things, race, ethnicity, nationality, English speaking, other languages, preferred language of speaking and writing, informed of right to interpreter services, requesting and use of interpreting services, as well as recording the class competency training for all the staff members that are included in participations in evaluations. And then conducting assessments of community health needs and assets, as well as evidence of partnering with the community. This was a study done last year, 2015, by the Office of Minority Health, and it shows which states have or strongly recommend cultural competence training that was signed into law. So the blue stripes show that, so that we have Washington, Oregon, California, New Mexico, Maryland, New Jersey, Connecticut, and that looks like it's it. And then in the legislation that is currently under consideration, we had states like New York, Oklahoma, Ohio, Illinois, and then states that denied legislation or it was vetoed would be Texas, Florida, and some of those other states there. So you can just see that across the country there are some places that have cultural sensitivity is very important. So at the surface level, you want to match your intervention materials and messages to the observable social and behavioral characteristics of the target population. Basically, this means if you're handing out a packet to maybe you're in Kennett Square where you have a high Hispanic population, You want to have people in the pictures and examples that you're giving for those materials to be of Hispanic origin so that it helps them relate to those people. And if you have a high Caucasian male population, you want to have Caucasian males in your materials so that they can relate to that. The deep structure kind of goes to understanding how the people in the target population perceive the cause, course, and treatment of health and mental health overall, as well as how religion, family, society, economics, and government influence the behavior you're targeting. So maybe you're targeting a behavior in a refugee population who smokes, and that is the only thing that they have brought with them from their country. They've lost all their possessions, all of their family, they only have that. So maybe targeting that behavior of smoking isn't as important to them as targeting the grief and loss of losing their family members or losing their old homes when they came to the United States. So while reducing smoking may be an overall important goal to the United States, in that specific refugee population, that shouldn't be your goal if that's the one thing they have that makes them feel comfortable. Or at least that's not the first thing you should be addressing with that population. So these are some aspects that you may have differences in when you're designing a culturally sensitive program. So goals and objectives could be different, your underlying theory or components of your theory, the mode of intervention. Maybe you'll have one-on-one sessions or group sessions depending upon what's the norm of that culture, the setting. Maybe you'll meet at the people's homes or at the home of an well-respected person in that culture versus having them come into your agency. Staffing, location, strategies of how you're going to get them to believe what you're telling them and implement it, the content of your message, the style and language of your print material. So again, if you have a mainly Spanish-speaking community, are you going to print your materials in English? No, you're going to print them in Spanish so that they'll read them and they understand them. And then something else to consider is your verbal versus nonverbal communication. So in some cultures, some nonverbal gestures may mean something completely different than what they mean in the United States. So you need, or eye contact in some cultures means disrespect, whereas in the United States it does not necessarily mean disrespect. So you want to be aware of those different verbal and nonverbal cues when you're communicating. Some cultural frameworks impact on evaluation. So different cultural groups have different methods of gathering information and making decisions, and you want to be cognizant of the different communication styles when you're collecting data and reporting it. So the cultural frameworks, orientation to data. Some people like numbers, and some people like stories. So you want to make sure that you're collecting some of both so that you're hitting both those targets. And then when you're writing up your report, maybe your report needs to be a very detailed, lengthy paper. Or maybe they only really need a one-page fact sheet of what was found. Or maybe they want a presentation and they want you to describe what you found so that they can ask questions and kind of go a little deeper all at one time. Then decision making. Maybe they have one point person who's in charge of making all the decisions for the evaluation. Or it could be collaborative and your whole team wants to have a say and wants to be involved. That can take more time, but it can also help make the evaluation better. Individualism versus collectivistic thinking can have an influence on your evaluation, as well as traditions and pace of life. So maybe you're scheduling meetings for a specific time and you are expecting to start exactly on time, but in the culture that this group of people you're working with comes from, a meeting's not doesn't start until everyone's there. So those are all things to kind of be considering when you're working. Here are four skills that help you become culturally competent. So, developing cultural awareness, developing intercultural communication skills, developing specific knowledge about the culture you're evaluating, and an ability to appropriately adapt evaluation methods and processes to different cultures. So, adapting evaluations, what you can do by working with stakeholder groups. Um, so, your stakeholders probably have a history of what's been practiced or other evaluations or knowledge of the target group or community. So, you can ask them to help you adapt your evaluation. Maybe there's been past efforts to ensure inclusion of this racial or ethnic group perspective in the evaluation process, either in your own community or elsewhere in research. You can have a racially and ethnically diverse evaluation team to help point out different aspects that may not work based on a specific race or culture. You could This will also help you recognize potential biases of members, what efforts you can make to counter those biases, and then what are your meaningful products. So do you have data tables, just a summary, videos, pictures, presentation, or just a one-page, really brief fact sheet? So those are all different things that you can have help from your stakeholders who may know more about the population you're working with for your evaluation.